Black Archive.
September 1st, 1939, Wieluń, Western Poland. 4:37 a.m. The town was still asleep when the first sound appeared above the clouds. Not explosions, not sirens, engines low, distant. Mechanical engines rolling slowly somewhere beyond the darkness, while rainwater from the previous night still clung to rooftops and cobblestone streets beneath the fading night sky. A cold wind moved through narrow alleys between brick homes and small shops, while weak lantern light reflected across puddles left by the storm. Inside the local hospital, nurses quietly adjusted blankets over sleeping patients, while bakers prepared ovens before sunrise and farmers rested beside open windows, listening to the soft movement of trees outside the town. Wieluń was calm in those final moments before disaster, the kind of ordinary silence that only exists before people realize history is about to break apart around them. Then the dogs started barking, one after another across different neighborhoods, as though the entire town had sensed something approaching before the people themselves understood it. Witnesses later described hearing the strange vibration growing above the clouds, like metallic thunder, dragging itself slowly across the sky. Some residents stepped outside and looked upward into darkness, confused by the sound, because officially the war had not even begun yet. There had been rumors, of course. Everyone in Poland understood Germany was becoming increasingly aggressive near the border. But nobody expected death to arrive before dawn, inside a town that held almost no military importance. Seconds later, the first bombs fell. The ground erupted beneath the center of Wieluń with such force that entire buildings collapsed before many residents even woke from sleep. Windows shattered across streets, while church towers disappeared behind clouds of smoke and debris. Horses screamed inside burning stables. Fire spread across rooftops almost instantly as brick walls crumbled into narrow roads filled with dust and panic. Families stumbled through darkness beneath falling ceilings, while children cried somewhere behind collapsing homes, and smoke swallowed entire sections of the town before sunrise had fully arrived. Witnesses later described people running into the streets, still wearing night clothes, covered in ash and blood, unable to understand who was attacking them or why. And that confusion became one of the most horrifying parts of the bombing, because Wieluń was not a fortress, not a defensive military headquarters, not an armored position protecting the Polish frontier. There were no massive troop concentrations hidden there, no major anti-aircraft batteries, no strategic command centers directing the Polish military. It was simply a civilian town, caught beneath the opening violence of a war that had already been decided long before the bombs began falling. At that exact moment, Nazi Germany had already launched its invasion plans against Poland. German armored divisions waited near the frontier prepared to advance before dawn, while Luftwaffe bomber squadrons followed carefully planned attack routes designed to destroy resistance before organized defense could fully mobilize. Only hours earlier, the Nazi regime had staged the Gliwice incident, using a fabricated Polish attack against a German radio station as justification for invasion. Adolf Hitler would soon address the German people, claiming Germany was acting in self-defense. But behind the propaganda, the machinery of war had already begun moving long before any official declaration. Entire military columns crossed into Poland beneath darkness, while aircraft pushed deeper into Polish airspace, searching for targets. Yet among all those operations, the bombing of Wieluń stood apart because the town itself offered almost no meaningful strategic value. Historians today continue debating whether the attack represented reckless military doctrine, deliberate terror bombing, or an early demonstration of psychological warfare designed to spread fear among civilians before organized resistance could form. But for the people trapped inside Wieluń that morning, the political explanations did not matter. What mattered was the sound above the clouds and the fire spreading through their homes. Among the residents was 23-year-old Jan Kowalski, a volunteer firefighter who had spent most of August helping reinforce buildings around town, after rumors of possible war spread across Western Poland. Like many young men at the time, Jan believed conflict with Germany seemed inevitable, but he assumed major fighting would happen closer to military positions near the border rather than inside civilian streets where families slept peacefully each night. He had never seen aerial bombardment before. Nobody in his family had. When the first explosion struck near the town center, the shockwave reportedly threw him from bed as glass shattered across the apartment above his parents' bakery. Witnesses later described dust filling entire rooms so quickly that people believed the buildings themselves were collapsing from inside rather than being bombed from the sky. Jan rushed into the streets, alongside other residents trying desperately to understand what was happening while church bells rang somewhere through smoke and darkness, beneath the continuing roar of aircraft engines overhead. According to later testimonies, he immediately joined other volunteers attempting to reach the local hospital, after hearing reports that civilians were trapped inside beneath debris and collapsed walls. But when they arrived, the hospital itself had already been hit. The scene outside the building barely resembled reality anymore. Smoke poured through shattered windows, while wounded patients stumbled into the streets, wrapped in blood-stained blankets, carried by exhausted nurses covered with ash and dust. Parts of the structure still burned as survivors searched through debris for missing. Relatives and medical staff attempted to drag injured civilians away from collapsing sections of the building before the fires spread further. Witnesses later remembered hearing distant voices trapped beneath rubble while glass crunched beneath their shoes and sparks from broken electrical wires illuminated smoke thick, enough to darken the morning sky. Then came the sound again. Engines, louder now, closer. People froze in the streets, listening to the growing mechanical roar descending through clouds overhead, because for several brief moments, some civilians believed the attack might already be ending. Instead, another bombing wave emerged through the smoke. Witnesses later described seeing the aircraft low enough to distinguish the black German crosses beneath their wings, before bombs began falling directly into streets crowded with fleeing civilians. One church collapsed almost instantly after a direct strike shattered its central structure. Nearby homes disappeared beneath explosions, powerful enough to tear walls apart and bury entire families beneath brick and timber. A school caught fire beside the marketplace while horses ran through the streets, screaming with their bodies engulfed in flames. Telephone poles snapped. Across roads already covered with debris and smoke, turned the sunrise into darkness so complete that survivors later claimed it felt like the town itself had vanished beneath the bombardment. The attack continued in waves for hours, not minutes, hours. By midday, much of Wieluń no longer resembled a functioning town, but a landscape of ruins filled with fire, shattered stone, twisted metal, and bodies buried beneath collapsed buildings. Survivors wandered through smoke, searching desperately for missing relatives, while refugees fled toward nearby roads, carrying children, blankets, and whatever possessions they managed to save before their homes disappeared beneath the bombing. Some residents attempted to escape into surrounding fields, but witnesses later claimed German aircraft continued strafing movement routes outside the town as panic spread through the countryside. Families became separated in the confusion. Parents lost children inside crowds, moving eastward away from the destruction. And perhaps the most disturbing detail of all was how early the bombing occurred, because much of the world had not yet even received confirmation that Germany had officially invaded Poland. For many historians, Wieluń represents one of the earliest large-scale terror bombings of the Second World War. A moment when civilians became targets before the war itself had even fully announced its arrival to the world. In the decades that followed, survivors carried memories that never truly faded. Interviews recorded years after the war revealed people who still panicked at the sound of aircraft engines passing overhead, even during peacetime. Some refused to sleep near windows because distant thunder reminded them of bombs falling before sunrise. One nurse who survived the hospital attack reportedly spent the rest of her life unable to tolerate the sound of metal carts rolling across tile floors because the noise resembled collapsing debris inside the burning hospital corridors. Jan Kowalski survived physically, but according to relatives interviewed many years later, he never again trusted silence in the early morning hours, especially before dawn. He often woke suddenly during storms, believing he heard aircraft beyond the clouds. And throughout the rest of his life, he avoided speaking publicly about what he witnessed inside Wieluń, except for one detail he repeated constantly whenever people asked him about the war. He said the worst part was not the explosions themselves. It was the few seconds beforehand when the engines first appeared above the town and everyone looked upward without understanding that their world was already ending. Today, modern streets stand where much of Wieluń burned in September 1939. Memorials mark locations where civilians died beneath collapsing churches, hospitals and homes, while visitors walk peacefully through areas once buried beneath smoke and rubble during the opening hours of World War II. Yet some residents still describe certain mornings in autumn, when fog settles low over the town before sunrise and the wind moves strangely through the streets in complete silence. Quiet mornings, the kind that seem ordinary at first, until something about the stillness begins to feel wrong. Maybe history already explained everything that happened there. Maybe there is no mystery left. But the people who survived Wieluń understood something terrifying long before the rest of the world fully realized it. Modern war no longer required soldiers standing face to face on battlefields. Sometimes all it required was a sleeping town beneath the sound of approaching engines hidden beyond the clouds.